Well, hello everyone. So, pardon the intrusion, but I am going to assist you in examining this singular phenomenon in the history of art furniture. These striking geometric traces of the importance of the port city of Nantes and the surrounding area, an artistic moment that occurred on the cusp of the 17th and the 18th centuries, around the year 1700, often called armoires de boiserie. Boiserie in French meaning paneling, as these seem to evoke the type of interior woodwork that certain very special rooms at the time supposedly had. In any case, it is looking pretty good for 330 years old. And as usual, I'd like to welcome you to yet another video about this art furniture from the past, which I hope will interest seasoned collectors who might not have otherwise had the chance to examine this piece out of a book, just as much as it should help new enthusiasts to the subject better discern between general antiques and these much rarer, earlier works of decorative art. Decoration that is so finely designed and executed that it reaches the level of a true art form. Anyway, the first thing to do when approaching an armoire, as one does, is to look past the impressive size of pretty much almost all armoires into the details of period authenticity, quality, and artistic value, which are only going to be present in a select few. Most armoires to begin with are going to be post-industrial. They will be after the year 1840. You know, the sculpture that we see here on those types of armoires, well, it would be glued on, not sculpted into the mass of the wood. The point is that the majority of the armoires you'll encounter come from a totally different, much later paradigm, a commercial industrial one, not an earlier artisanal artistic one. But with that out of the way, this one is interesting because once you sift through all of the industrial antiques out there to find the small pocket of period originals, late 17th to early 19th century, it is still a harder question to find an outstanding period one representative of the height of that place and time. In 1924, the same model was published in a book by the then director of France's National Furniture Reserve, Guillaume Janot. This one is almost identical to that one. They were probably made in the same workshop, at least off of the same design. But anyway, we can see how this was being appreciated 100 years ago as a real collector's item. It was published as a general benchmark for great armoires of this variety, regional ones around the year 1700, and that's why I've selected it as pertinent material for a longer video discussion today. At least I still have hair. At least I still have hair. Now, you might have noticed that I used the French term regional because it's important not to obscure the specialness of an item like this underneath the blanket term country furniture, which is very ambiguous and which would imply something far more utilitarian and rustic. This was not made in Paris, so technically it is under the umbrella Provincial that we use in the English language, but the French language goes to the trouble to designate this really as an outstanding regional work from a region around the year 1700, a very specific port that was not at all extraneous. And there is another video, which will be linked at the end of this one, that attempts to clarify the horribly ambiguous term country furniture. Please do check it out. Now, the administrator of a very special French furniture website, meublits.com, agrees with me in this somewhat common knowledge among furniture nutcases that this is indeed from the area around the city of Nantes, Pays de la Loire. It's just below Brittany in northwestern France. And he came over here to look at the piece, and he mentioned that in general we associate the brass metalwork with coastal areas because apparently this alloy was thought to resist the corrosion of the seaside air more than steel did. At the same time, this brass can be used to conceptually date this piece simply because brass is the type of hardware that we're going to see on the next generation of outstanding port pieces made in the city of Nantes, which are a little bit more famous than these from the golden age of port furniture in solid mahogany. We looked at another one of these featured previously on the channel, which still had the steel metalwork. in the form of a flame flickering up and flickering down, which we no longer have here. And so at a glance, the presence of that steel would make us think that perhaps that one predates this one by 10 or 20 years. But oddly enough, the sculpted decor on that one is more early 18th century, and this one seems to be tethered a little more to the late 17th. So none of these things are very exact, but I'm giving you the information anyway. Also, the almost identical one published, which didn't have sculpture on these diamond points. That was the only difference. So technically this one's a little fancier. Well, it belonged to Alain Desac, who inhabited the Château du Bois de Breuil, which was demolished in 1966. And it was in Chalons, right in the heart of that region where these are known to be from. And since pieces like this back in those days, 100 years ago and more, they didn't really tend to leave families as much as they do today. And so we can surmise that perhaps that one was first delivered there to that chateau, which no longer exists. Especially since chateaux used to be sold with their contents when they were sold rarely. So that's why back in the 20s, if you had a piece that was photographed in a chateau, it's possible that it was the original piece, because the real estate tradition at the time was you would sell the chateau with the furniture. At least that was way more common. Even though this piece might have been made in the early 18th century rather than the late 17th century, a Paris court furniture expert told me that some of the aspects of the paneling inside indicate more of an early 18th century date of creation here. Regardless of that, we are going to be conceptualizing this as something that should shut more gracefully as a late 17th century piece of furniture, because the 17th century is really the period that this belongs to in spirit. We see the straight lines, the classicism, this cornice which is inherited from Renaissance work of the previous century, based on the Corinthian order, the entablature of the Corinthian order, with friezes of consoles up there and friezes of dentils. And then we also see the key decorative devices of French 17th century furniture styles, the Louis XIII and the Louis XIV styles, expressed regionally here. These discs, for instance, are really typical of the Louis XIII style, which was known for a heavy use of turned walnut. And the Louis XIII style is one that lasts the entire 17th century, even though the monarch only reigned from 1610 to 1643. But Louis XIII work also, in addition to the turned wood, it was known for a geometric simplification of the excesses that previous Renaissance work had reached in its sculpture. Louis XIII armoires are also known to rest on these interesting bun feet. Louis XIV ones do as well, but 14th, 13th, it kind of blends during the 17th century in regional work. Okay, and we should look at the holes on the insides of the doors here, which at first I thought were traces of the candelabra which once would have been mounted here. You see that on some armoires from this period. It's quite wonderful. It really would have helped display the silverware that was stored inside. But I noticed these holes down below, and by the way, you really do need to check out what a piece like this looks like in candlelight. That's part of the aesthetics of these pieces from the old world, is they were meant to be seen at night in candlelight, and that's not something we appreciate nearly as much anymore today. Anyway, I noticed the holes here and realized, oh, those aren't holes left from candelabra. Those are holes which are left from the turning wheel. We can even see this circular trace there where this was mounted onto a turning wheel, and as it was spinning around, they were sculpting out these beautiful rings. Now, also, thanks to the administrator of Mublitz.com, I got my hands on a very special article written a couple decades ago by researcher Hubert Maheu, regrouping, synthesizing a lot of information about these mysterious Nantaise armoires. And he presents examples of all the typical panel designs that you might encounter on these. According to him, the design that we see here is particularly emblematic, with these rings that surround a spinning sculpted rosace, rosette of spinning acanthus. And then the rings themselves are surrounded by these four irregular motifs that leave room for acanthus to be sculpted in the corners. And then, of course, there's just a little bit of negative space left to showcase the relief, the high relief of these sculpted motifs. He also noticed that the sculpture is sometimes poinçonné, speckled. I don't know how they say that in English, but we can see that the background of the sculpture is in fact poinçonné, a bit like marble. It's a nice little detail upon close inspection. So with the exception of the arrangement of the panels, the structure of these pieces doesn't seem to vary much. In another video where we looked at one of these very rare pieces, well, that one happened to have a central quadrilobe motif with 2 Maltese cross panels above and below. I do really love the Maltese crosses surrounded by these diamond points, which are really iconic emblems, decorative devices of the Louis XIII and Louis XIV styles. Here they are, the diamond points are arranged into this 8-pointed star very aggressively, loosely referred to as a Maltese cross in decorative arts history. And anyway, speaking of the sculpture, it is clearly inspired by these ornamentalist guidebooks which were published and distributed throughout the last part of the 17th century, notably published by Androuet du Cerceau from 1660 to 1710. In any case, the sculpture that we see here, it is very much true to the second half of the 17th century. So with all that being said, even if this piece was made in 1715, as sometimes regional centers were slow to adopt whatever the newest style taking hold in Paris was, well, when we understand the history of 17th century design, we see that this very much, nevertheless, remains a 17th century idea. And do take note of these dowels that are popping out of the wood here over time as the piece has shrunk. That's a simple but good thing to look for. Doesn't prove much, but we do want to see that on a piece that's supposedly 300 plus years old. Also, we can take a look at the back, which is a picture-perfect example of what you'd expect to find on a piece circa 1700. Nothing back there was machined. Note the oxidation, the very obvious rough and irregular saw marks. It appears to have been covered with a type of paper, a dust paper, which would keep dust from coming through the back at some point. And there even seems to be a shipping label back there that's totally illegible, probably saying that this was delivered to Marie Antoinette and Benjamin Franklin. But, you know, the calligraphy, the font is very old, and I think that that's charming, even though there's nothing useful that we can glean from that shred. Now, regarding the advanced age of these venerable old objects, the Paris court expert who came over here reminded me that the cornices were often remade during the 19th century. These are removable and therefore they can be lost, and also being such a long piece of wood there, they tend to warp. And so he pointed out that this cornice has most likely been replaced during the 19th century. That was written about in Hubert Maillot's article. Apparently that's a very acceptable restoration, almost an expected one to find. That being said, most interestingly, the presence of the original cornice, which turns out to be very special and rare on furniture like this, is something that we noticed on the previous armoire that we looked at, and that old cornice is what caused someone not to buy it from me at some point. Someone was drawn to the piece, like the Dukes of Brittany would be, as there is one of these displayed in the Château des Ducs de Bretagne in Nantes. It's a wonderful museum in the center of Nantes you should check out. So anyway, these are appealing, people are attracted to them, but they noticed that the cornice, there was a gap in the old cornice, and they felt that the piece was defective, that I wasn't announcing the problems that the piece may have had, and don't get me wrong, it had all sorts of problems, but that was not one of them. You know, problems relating to the fact that it's 330 years old. And unfortunately, I didn't know how to share tactfully this perspective with them, that the presence of the original cornice was one of the most special aspects of the piece. The gap, while sort of annoying, could simply be masked, but really the little warp there to the cornice should be appreciated as something that makes that particular armoire even more outstanding among the already very rare and outstanding armoires of this variety, which are pretty much unfindable to begin with. So anyway, the point is that it's really important for anyone who's approaching the subject of 200 to 400-year-old furniture not to approach these items with the same lens that we use to approach new items for our homes today. And in cases like this, they're in much better shape than what we might expect something this old to be, and that's because they've always been appreciated as a work of art from the time that they were made. So the Saint-Colomban Church, 50 miles south of Nantes, conserves a really impressive collection of these special regional works. About 150 years ago, the Abbey brought a bunch of them together and built a special room for them. So that goes to show how even 150 years ago, these were already presenting a real conservational concern. Now, collectors of the 19th century really loved pieces like this. There was a trend during the second half of the 19th century, and a little earlier, for everything that they called Gothic. And their use of the term Gothic didn't apply to true pieces from the late medieval period. They used the word Gothic as a type of amalgam for Renaissance pieces, late medieval pieces, 17th century pieces, you know, anything that was kind of dark and moody and very old. That's what the 19th century collectors referred to as Gothic. So there was a big resurgence of interest in these pieces throughout the 19th century. That was also encouraged and promoted by antique dealers who took an interest in finding these and promoting them to the market. Imagine that. Can't imagine anyone would do such a thing. This should not be sold like some sort of widget. A final point that I might make is the confusion that I've encountered as to the provenance of these armoires. It seems like 1 in 5 times someone will actually get it right and designate Vendée or this area around Nantes. I've heard them described as being from the southwest of France, being from the north, from Lorraine, pretty much anywhere but from where they're actually from. But part of the confusion is that port furniture, this most sophisticated facet of all country furniture, again, ambiguous term, when we think of port furniture, generally we're thinking of furniture from the generation after this, which is really known for being in exotic red mahogany. Pieces after 1720, the widespread importation of mahogany into Europe, arriving into the ports from the West Indies. And this is a beautiful example of how these cosmopolitan, worldly centers of commerce with access to travel and trade and new ideas were making outstanding furniture before the age of mahogany. So, with all of that being said, everybody, thank you all for watching, and please subscribe to the channel if you have appreciated this video, if you'd like to help promote this information, a little greater awareness, easy access to the difference between regular antiques and these earlier pre-industrial works of art. Thank you.